Our speakers are Sarah Aoun. She's a Ford Mozilla Open Web Fellow, security trainer, and activist working on the intersection of tech, human rights, and transformative justice. And Jessie Daniels, the author or editor of 5 books, including Going Public, A Guide for Social Scientists. Her first 2 books, White Lies and Cyber Racism, examine white nationalism on either side of the rise of the popular internet. She's currently at work on a new book, Tweeter Storm, The Rise of the Alt-Right and the Mainstreaming of White Nationalism. Daniels is a professor of sociology at Hunter College and at the Graduate Center of CUNY. You can find her on Twitter at Jessie NYC.
Hi, everyone. I don't actually have any slides. I have a few notes. Just off the train from DC, and before that, Europe. So it's my first stop back in New York in about 3 weeks, and I'm here. So I hope everyone's doing good. I'm sorry? Oh, sorry. About my background a little bit, I'm a programmer. I work in digital security, data security, and human rights. I grew up in Lebanon, and I've been here for a few years. And I'm a fellow with Mozilla, Ford Mozilla fellow this year, working specifically on online harassment, and as well digital security with vulnerable populations in New York, around the US, and in the Middle East, which is what I do. So the topic of this panel being what's wrong with online communities, I guess a little bit broad, but I'll try to cover as much as possible from my experience. I grew up in Lebanon, and I still remember having access to the internet back then and what it really meant, which it really opened up like a world of possibilities for me, especially growing up queer in Lebanon and having access to online communities of like LGBT folks. And really learning like everything that I learned through that, and it really meant a lot. And online communities, or having access to an online community was incredibly powerful. And there are a lot of really amazing things that come with that, especially for folks from marginalized communities, folks from minority groups, and folks in specific, in particular societies, like the one that I grew up in. So having access to that type of information really changed my life, and really brought upon like a lot of really great things. But as we know, online communities, or the internet, as much as it brings a lot of openness and freedom, also is a double-edged sword, and there's a lot of issues with it and a lot of problems with it. And I think specifically in the context of the US, when we think about what's wrong with online communities, we think about different things. One is issues around security. How much can you share online without really like exposing yourself, or without really putting yourself at risk? And that could mean like being part of being queer and being online and like talking about that, and then having your parents like see what you're saying online. So things like that. It can mean there are issues around trust. So how can you trust other people that you're building relationships with online? And there's a lot of examples of that, of people posing as someone else, or not really being who they say they are on the internet, and then building trust with other people and like trying to get information from them, anything from like phishing and scams to more serious things. We think of, I think also specifically here, of issues around online harassment. So what it means to be an active member of the internet, to be on social media, cyberbullying, whether it's with kids in schools, once you go home. I mean, before having this type of access to the internet, going back home, you would be putting behind you everything that's happening in school, but right now you don't really have that option anymore. That type of harassment follows you because you're constantly connected, and obviously that takes like an incredible psychological, emotional toll on you. So whether it's kids in schools or even as adults, like being any type of active member of social media or the internet, you're constantly followed by all of this type of harassment. And harassment is specifically gendered, and women are a lot more targeted than men. And I can assure you that I can say with almost absolute certainty that every woman who's actively part of the internet has been harassed or targeted at some point or another, whether that's just sexist remarks or something a little bit more serious like rape threats, death threats, any type of online abuse. And so when we're thinking about problems or issues with online communities here in the US or in the global north, I would say, the conversation is usually centered around that, is usually centered around online harassment of women, or just like more general online harassment. And when we're thinking about the global south and issues of online communities or access to the internet in the global south, we're thinking about repressive governments jailing people over a Facebook comment or a tweet or something that they're doing like that. So the government going after people and putting them in jail over their online activity and their online just like commentary. And I think it really, how to say this? When we're thinking about what's wrong with online communities, we really draw this distinction when we're thinking about the global north versus the global south. And it really paints like that type of picture where for the global south, we're thinking about repressive communities and repressive governments going after people. And in the global north, we're mostly thinking about like things like online harassment or targeted like abuse online. But I just want to point that out and to say that working on digital security issues, on physical security issues, and working with communities in the US and the Middle East, the similarities are a lot more obvious than they look. As in, even working in the US, we are talking also about repressive governments going after folks, just like the government that we're under right now. But, so just to give you an example, Facebook publishes a transparency report every year. And for the one that came out for 2017, in the first half of 2017, the government demanded access to about 80,000 accounts on Facebook. And out of the 80, that's just in the first half of 2017. So let's assume that they probably demanded the same amount in the second half. So let's say about like 180,000 demands and requests for information from Facebook by the government, and out of all those requests, about 85 to 90% of them were granted. So, and there's a specific page on Facebook that you can go to if you're a law enforcement agent and demand access to an account. Like it's facebook.com/requests, so you can check it out yourself if you want. But Facebook is demanding access, the government and law enforcement agencies are demanding access to Facebook accounts in the US, and particularly also in India and Germany, in France and the UK, and in most cases, definitely over 50% of the time, like in the US, it's about 85% of the time, Facebook grants access to that. And with those requests comes usually a non-disclosure agreement, so Facebook can't actually like tell us what these folks are specifically requesting, but we also know that they're going after specific activists. Just like what happened during the Dakota Pipeline access protests, the government was using Facebook as a tool to control protesters and to basically target protesters a lot more. Also, another thing to point out is DreamHost, which is a service provider for the internet, host servers, was asked to reveal the IP address of disruptj20.org website. So for folks, literally like anyone, so anyone that was going to the website to look up information about protests against Trump, against government, so we're talking about millions of people. So DreamHost as a company was asked by the Department of Justice to give up the IP address of over 3 million people accessing the website. And these are things that we normally think of in other societies in the global south where protesters are being targeted for that type of activity online, but it's happening more and more here. And it's not really talked about as much because the conversation is mostly dominated by other topics such as online harassment, which is not to say that online harassment is not important, but I think we're just constantly thinking of this like, oh, us, like the global north versus the global south, and it's different, and we're not going after people the same way that they're doing it in like other places like the Middle East or Iran. Another thing that happens a lot is Facebook takes down accounts based on government requests, and they've done that a lot in Palestine specifically, by requests of the US government and the Israeli government. And we're talking about thousands and thousands of accounts. And most Palestinians, about like 96% of Palestinians use Facebook as a means for, to get access to news and to know like what's up in the world, basically. And so they're taking down these accounts based on what the Israeli government is demanding. And we're talking about thousands of accounts, and they're taking them down specifically based on the fact that they're inciting violence. But we're talking about a bunch of like news accounts also, specific people and news accounts. And they're doing it more and more, and obviously it's not the same thing that is happening for Israeli accounts. And we know, I mean, needless to say, there are a lot of Israelis that also call out very publicly for the murder of Arabs, and obviously nothing is happening around that, but definitely Palestinian accounts are being taken down constantly on a daily basis. Same thing for the, based on the request of the US government, the Chechen president's account was also taken down because Chechnya was put on a sanctions list. So the US demanded of Facebook to take down that account because that government was put on a sanctions list. And just to note that obviously, like if that were to happen in another country, say if Iran were to call out the US for, I don't know, for having declared Jerusalem like this, the capital of Israel, and Iran were all of a sudden to say, let's put the US on the sanctions list because of their actions and what they did, Facebook is definitely not going to ban the US or like Trump from their online community. Twitter is not going to do it. So we're constantly recreating like structures of power, and what really is the case here in terms of online censorship and like who has access to these online communities and who can access these online communities is solely based on like structures of power, structures of racism, and things that we experience like on a day-to-day basis here. So I think just thinking generally about the question of like what is wrong with online communities, it's not really what's wrong with online communities, it's what's wrong with us and what's wrong with us as a society and how it's constantly being represented and reflected in online communities. And it's based on structures of power. And that power is basically at the hands of these huge corporations. And we are active on Facebook, we're active on Twitter, we're active on a bunch of different social media platforms or different online communities, thinking that we have this freedom to do what we want and to say that what we wish as well. But it really is, I mean, it's really just an illusion of freedom, and they really operate kind of as a prison where you're constantly monitored and constantly surveilled for what you're doing, and then based on whatever the most powerful player is in that sphere, what they want, like if they want to censor you or to kick you out of this platform, they can. And we've seen that so many times, whether it's with like the Israel-Palestine issue that I just mentioned, or the US government demanding like certain accounts to be banned from Facebook, or women getting banned from Twitter for like speaking out about online harassment. So we're constantly recreating these structures of power because these online communities, unfortunately, are being created under certain structures of power, which are all these Silicon Valley companies. So I guess what I want to say at the end of this is that all sound, I mean, it feels like there's not a lot of freedom to do things or hope around online communities, or like how do you really build movements and power when you're constantly surveilled and constantly monitored. And I think a lot of people more and more are trying to create their own online communities like outside of these structures. So I know saying something like, oh, let's recreate Twitter elsewhere, let's recreate Facebook elsewhere feels almost impossible because they're dominating the market. But in certain communities in the Middle East, in Latin America, and South America, the way that folks are organizing is by creating their alternative platforms, which is also what the alt-right is doing here in the US, and we've seen that a lot. And they've definitely taken advantage of that opportunity to create their own version of Facebook, their own version of Twitter, their own version of like basically anything that folks are using. But my hope is to see more and more of that happening, basically a decentralization of power and not really having it at the hands of these huge corporations, to be able for us at least to keep like organizing and to keep building power. Basically, but that's it. Thank you.
We'll do questions at the end for both of us. Okay, thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm Jessie Daniels. I am getting over a cold recently, so I'm just going to apologize if I start having a coughing fit. I'm not going to die, I swear. It may sound like it, though. Let me just find this presentation, which I just closed. Yes, there we are. Thank you. Please open. Brilliant. Thank you so much. So thanks so much for having me, and thanks to Megan for inviting me, and Anne for inviting me, and shout out to Aoun, my student who's here somewhere. Maybe she left. Oh, she's back there. Hey, great. So wonderful to see happy, familiar faces after I've been cloistered with my respiratory ixue. So I want to talk a little bit about race and online knowledge communities, which is what I think of Wikipedia as, and sort of what some of the issues are with that. And I'm going to do a little bit of background on my research, which is going to seem a little far afield at first, but I'm going to connect it at the end. So stay with me as I go through this. So as the introduction mentioned, I've spent the last 20 or more years studying white supremacists online, or white nationalists now. And I wrote these two books. The first one, White Lies, which is based on my dissertation, and then the second one, Cyber Racism. And they sort of by accident ended up being on either side of the rise of the popular internet. That just sort of coincided with what was going on in the world and my research. I want to tell you about each one of these and how they relate to the production of knowledge, because I think it's relevant to what you all are doing with Wikipedia. So the first project that I did, White Lies, was an archival project where I drove from where I was in graduate school, University of Texas at Austin, to Montgomery, Alabama, to the Klan Watch archives at the Southern Poverty Law Center, and through their largesse was able to stand over a hot Xerox machine for 3 or 4 days, and I made hard copies of almost 400 newsletters of white supremacist publications. And I took those back to Austin and I analyzed those, and they gave me a PhD, and then I went on and I did a postdoc, and I continued to analyze these, and that became the first book, White Lies, published by Routledge in 1997. And part of what I was analyzing in that, instead of doing a quantitative analysis, I did a qualitative analysis of the text and the images. In those newsletters, there were lots and lots of line drawings or cartoons, some of them like this one. This is one of the ones that's included in that book, and if you can't see the text here, it says, "White men built this nation," emphasis on built, "white men are this nation." And it's a white guy in like a work vest and a work cap or a baseball cap, and in the background there's an airline jet flying over, there's a bridge, and there's like a big city, sort of indicating that these are the things that white men have built in this country, and therefore that they are entitled in some special way to citizenship, to ownership, to various kinds of rights. So this was the kind of rhetoric that I found in those white supremacist publications, rather than what I had expected to find, which was a kind of laundry list of different groups that they didn't approve of. There was a lot of discussion about white people and how great white people are, supposedly. So part of the argument that I made there in that first book was that whiteness and white supremacy was gendered, which may sound obvious now. They're very different ideas about white men versus white women. May seem obvious now in 1997. Nobody was saying that yet. The other argument that I made in White Lies was that there was a resonance, a connection between what I was reading in these extremist publications, what I had driven from Austin to Montgomery to find in the Klan Watch archive, between what was in those publications and what was appearing in mainstream political discourse, such as Pat Buchanan's 1992 speech before the Republican National Convention. If you are old enough to remember that, you know what I'm talking about. If you're not, go home and Google a video of that. But these kinds of resonances still exist. This is a more recent example from the History Channel. Excuse me. I'll give you a second just to see what this show is about. I never watched this show, but I appreciate the ad here because it makes my point very nicely. The men who built America, and the tagline for this show is the American economy was linked by railroads, fueled by oil, and built by steel. And here are the very charming white men who built those things, right? And so why is that white supremacy in my view? Because what it does is it ignores the actual labor of people who were enslaved, of people who were Chinese immigrants, who built those railroads and got the oil out of the ground and harvested the cotton, all the rest of it, you know what I'm saying, right? So it tells a particular story that is not neutral, shall we say. Okay. All right, so time passed, the internet happened, I went on, and I no longer had to drive vast distances to access this extremist literature. I could find it on my computer and often did. Anyway, life happened. I also left academia and went to work in the internet industry for a while, all the while sort of with one eye paying attention to what white supremacists were doing online. That eventually became the second book called Cyber Racism, which came out in 2000. I spent a lot of time at Stormfront, which is the largest white supremacist portal online. It was briefly deplatformed in 2017, but it's back online now. And basically what I found in that time period, and what had elapsed between 97 and 2009, was that white supremacist rhetoric was much easier to access. It was global now in a way that it hadn't been before, and it was more participatory. So there were more people who were participating in the creation of white supremacist rhetoric. So one of my big conclusions from that book was that racism is changing because of digital technologies. And part of what was, just going back to my key point for you folks, that knowledge was being changed as well, and the way that people created knowledge was changing. And I'll tell you what I mean by that in a second. But one of the key issues here is that hard-won moral, political, and legal victories were now up for debate. And I'll give you a prime example. Here we are on the weekend before Martin Luther King holiday. And I'm sure most of you knowledgeable internet literacy people that you are know about this site. Excuse me. But if you haven't run across it, it's martinlutherking.org, and it appears at first glance to be a tribute site to Dr. King, but is in fact, I discovered this first through college students of mine on Long Island who just typed into a search engine, it was ages ago, it was like Alta Vista or something like that, typed into a search engine Martin Luther King, and this was the site that came up. And there was just a piece in the Daily Beast. It's still there. It still comes up on Google on the first page of results. But if you scroll to the bottom of the website, which we know 85% of people never do, you see that it's hosted by Stormfront. And when you click on the link and go it leads to a discussion forum on Stormfront, what you find there is a discussion that seeks to turn back the clock on civil rights, seeks to undermine the value of civil rights by degrading Dr. King's reputation. Did he plagiarize his dissertation? Therefore, we should not have civil rights. Did he cheat on his wife? Therefore, we should not have civil rights. So what did I learn from these two books? Basically, what I learned was that white supremacists are what I'm calling innovation opportunists. They take a very serious look at whatever the latest technology is, and they look for opportunities in that new technology to make a way through for their ideology, right? So I have a quote in the Cyber Racism book from what's his name, David Duke, who's talking in 1998, right? So a year after my first book came out, and he's saying, I see the internet as this wonderful opportunity to get our ideology out there. There's never been an opportunity like this. So he and people like Don Black, who started Stormfront and the Martin Luther King site, saw early on what the opportunities were in that technology to get their ideology out. I'll just say one quick historical note that white supremacists have been doing this for more than a century. You may not know, I mean, you probably know a movie that was based on a racist novel by Thomas Dixon and became this movie by D.W. Griffith. But what you may not know is that when this movie came out, the Klan, which had millions of Americans in it at the time, said, what we need is our own movie studios. And so the Klan created their own movie studios and started creating their own films as a way to get their ideology out, right? So they have this pattern of being innovation opportunists, right? So my current book, Tweet Storm, that was mentioned at the beginning, is continuing this. How is this continuing in this age of social media and algorithms? And very quickly, I have 3 quick points that I'm not going to go into, but just to sort of give you a sense of what's coming in that book. Part of what's happening is that the rise of Trump has made a huge difference in white nationalists. It's legitimated them in a particular kind of way. We have a really different media ecosystem now. For 20 years, Fox News has laid the groundwork for right-wing ideology to be ascendant. And what all that's allowed has meant the mainstreaming of what I'm calling the mainstreaming of white nationalism. So these ideas through, have you heard this term, the Overton window, right? What's acceptable discourse to debate? That's part of what the white supremacists are using to make these points acceptable to discuss in public. So how does this connect to you folks at Wikipedia? It has a lot, I think, to connect with you folks at Wikipedia. So, right, one of the founding ethos of a neutral point of view. Sorry. But I want to raise a question about that as a provocation and ask, is this innovation, really this core value of Wikipedia, is this a place that white nationalists see as an opportunity that they can exploit? Is this an innovation that they can exploit? So I'll just give you a couple of examples and close with these. If you go on the white nationalist page at Wikipedia and you scroll down to the talk section, right, there's at the very bottom, this is from July of 2017, there's a comment that was removed, and I don't know what the comment was, but it says the previous author disparaged
What we're talking about, a vector point for Wikipedia might be, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure I completely understand the question, but if I understand you correctly, that is there a way in which Wikipedia gets treated as an authority and people don't realize it's being edited? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and that's some of
Partly?
the origins is that this is not a new thing. This is something that's been kind of going along to with how people
sure.
perceive as knowledge.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's absolutely predates Wikipedia. It didn't start with Wikipedia. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the traditional response to the critique you just offered that people with abhorrent viewpoints such as white supremacy have the ability to infiltrate the site is that neutral point of view is a starting point, but it's not a neutral point of view, meaning that any point of view is equally recognized. Yeah. The fact that some people think the Earth is round and some people think the Earth is flat doesn't mean that we give 50% of the shape of the Earth article to the flat earthers and 50% of the shape of the Earth to the round earthers. We provide information on what the consensus of reliable sources report. And if there is a discernible, not completely fringe minority point of view, we report that point of view, but we report it as the minority point of view. And this works reasonably well in scientific articles, even some historical articles. When Holocaust deniers come along, we do not accept it because one of them published a book that sold 8 copies last year. Maybe the Holocaust didn't happen. We have an article about Holocaust denial which treats it as a, very small minority fringe view of some dangerous people. And similarly, in the white supremacist articles should be presented in the same way. Now, the problem is when you've got something that ties directly into current events, it is understandable that Wikipedia is not meant to be the source for what happened last week. Okay, we build up over time, and in terms of it, so the problem then becomes who decides, because there can be a fear that we have to tread a thin line between screening out views that clearly no one in the room would believe in and acting like a board of censors, and how do we draw that line?
Absolutely. I didn't mean to suggest that because this had happened this week, it wasn't on Trump's page that was somehow an indictment. I really meant to suggest that, to sort of point the way that this will be an interesting page to watch, right, to see what happens. And I think that the talk discussions that happen at Wikipedia are a place where, can you please not take my picture? Thanks. I think the talk pages at Wikipedia are going to be a very interesting place to watch for this battle over knowledge and race around white nationalism, especially as it gets voiced from the Oval Office, right? I mean, I think that's really the thing that we're going to have to be watching. Sorry, other questions?
And I think we have our one last question. Yeah. Hi, thank you both for a wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. My question is more specifically for Sarah, but I think both of you probably have great insight. Are there spaces that you're coming across in online communities or outside of our mainstream online communities that you recommend as locations for, I guess, how would I put it? Social media explorers to move to outside of, let's say, Twitter or Facebook? Are there spaces that you think would be appropriate to colonize in a different way? I know colonize is
I know, I was
going
going
to
to say colonize. I was like, okay, I'm with you
Yeah,
with that
keep
question.
going.
I ain't got to colonize. I was like, I don't know. No worries. Yeah, there's definitely a bunch of, is this working? I think, yes. There's definitely a lot of, there's definitely a lot of these different groups. None of them at the scale of something like Twitter and Facebook. But definitely happening more and more. And it really, the places where I see them mostly are within activist groups that are creating their own network and their own internet infrastructure. So completely off the grid from everything that you would see. And it really is to address a bunch of different things, but mostly it is for privacy and security. So even for someone like me to get access to one of these groups, like I would have to know these folks personally. So it's not like, oh, going to a page like facebook.com and then signing up for it. It would really mean that you are part of this community in one way or another to be able to get access to that space. And it really is to just provide privacy and security in terms of being able to build movements. So, yeah. Yeah, of course.
Thank you both.
Okay, so we have cut into the cakes to fuel, to provide sweet fuel for our lightning talks. So if you would like